In May 1945, the guns of the Second World War fell silent across Europe. The Third Reich lay in ruins. Many millions of people died. Entire cities were reduced to ruins. Behind the scenes of major international conferences in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, the victorious Allied powers discussed the future of Europe. Borders were redrawn, and spheres of influence were delineated. The Red Army, advancing westward, occupied a significant portion of Eastern and Central Europe. The officers of the Soviet political police soon followed in its wake. The Kremlin was determined to establish puppet regimes loyal to Moscow in the occupied territories. This Kremlin goal triggered one of the most sweeping political transformations in modern history. In just a few years, much of Eastern Europe was transformed into a bloc of communist satellite states, loyal to the Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin. The Kremlin already had a ready-made model. In 1940, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were incorporated into the Soviet Union through a carefully orchestrated political process. These countries were occupied by the Red Army. Controlled pseudo-elections were held under conditions of total propaganda, as a result of which pro-Soviet governments were installed in these countries. Political opponents were neutralized through repression and fear. The opposition and intelligentsia, who understood the Kremlin's imperial nature, were deported en masse, along with their families. In 1945, the Soviet occupation administration began to implement similar methods throughout Eastern Europe. The Kremlin quickly and easily established control over Bulgaria. Formally, Bulgaria was a monarchy. However, Tsar Simeon II was a child, and the country was ruled by the pro-communist Fatherland Front. In September 1946, a pseudo-referendum organized by the Soviet secret police was held in Bulgaria, which resulted in the abolition of the monarchy and the declaration of the People's Republic of Bulgaria under the rule of the Bulgarian Communist Party. The government was headed by Georgy Dimitrov, the last chairman of the Communist International and a deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. The People's Republic of Bulgaria became one of Moscow's most loyal satellite states. In 1945, in large Polish cities captured by the Red Army, mass rapes by occupying soldiers occurred. The capture of Krakow by Soviet troops was accompanied by a wave of rapes of women and girls, as well as widespread theft of personal property. Unlike Bulgaria, Poland posed a far more serious political problem for the Soviet Union. For centuries, Polish national identity had been built on resistance to foreign domination. In August 1920, the Red Army suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Polish army in the Battle of Warsaw. After the defeat of the Polish army in October 1939, Germany and the Kremlin divided Poland and established a new border under the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty. At Yalta, the Allied powers agreed to form a provisional government for Poland from a compromise coalition. But Stalin manipulated the agreement for his own purposes. In June 1945, the Provisional Government of National Unity was formed, with Polish communists holding key positions. Politicians associated with the Polish government in exile were given only minor roles with limited influence. Communist control was strengthened through the rigging of the 1946 Polish national pseudo-referendum and the rigged 1947 Polish parliamentary pseudo-elections. Meanwhile, anti-communist resistance groups, later known collectively as the Cursed Soldiers, continued armed struggle against the Soviet occupation. Thousands of anti-Soviet resistance soldiers died in armed clashes or were persecuted and executed by the Polish Ministry of Public Security. Officers of the Ministry of Public Security, led by their Soviet counterparts, carried out mass repressions against the opposition. In June 1945, a trial of 16 leaders of the Polish underground state took place in Moscow, which became known as the Trial of the 16. By the late 1940s, communist leader and Stalin's puppet, Boleslav Bierut, headed the Polish People's Republic, firmly integrated into the Soviet sphere of influence as a satellite state. The political situation in Romania was complicated for the Kremlin by the popularity of King Michael I. In August 1944, King Michael overthrew the pro-Axis dictatorship of Ion Antonescu, declared war on Germany and placed Romania among the Allied powers. However, the horrors of the Soviet occupation of Romania followed regardless. During the first months of the occupation, more than 350,000 Romanian women were raped by Soviet troops. Ironically, Stalin awarded the Romanian king the prestigious Soviet Order of Victory. But the honors did not translate into political independence. In March 1945, under intense pressure from the Kremlin, King Michael appointed a pro-communist government led by Petru Grosa. For a brief period, Romania was a monarchy under a communist government. In November 1946, general elections were held in Romania, which were largely rigged by the Soviet-led communist government, through systemic intimidation, replacing ballot boxes, and altering tallies. The pro-communist ruling bloc has officially declared a landslide victory despite widespread popular resistance. The fraudulent elections served as a turning point in Romania's Sovietization. Within just over a year, all significant political opposition was outlawed, and King Michael was forced to abdicate. Romania was transformed into a communist republic and a Kremlin satellite country. Despite Czechoslovakia being recognized as a victim of German aggression and an ally of the Allied powers, during the initial period of the occupation of Czechoslovakia, Red Army soldiers committed large-scale acts of sexual violence against civilian women. The most brutal and systematic abuses occurred in regions of Czechoslovakia with a high concentration of ethnic Germans, such as the Sudetenland. Czechoslovakia entered the post-war era with strong democratic traditions. The legitimate president of Czechoslovakia, Edvard Beneš, returned from London at the end of the war and formed a coalition government called the National Front, with Communist Party leader Klement Gottwald as prime minister. The Third Czechoslovak Republic was formed in April 1945. Communists occupied key ministerial posts, including the crucial Ministry of Internal Affairs, to which the police were subordinated. With these key ministries, the Communists were able to suppress non-communist opposition, place Communist Party members in leadership positions, and lay the groundwork for an attempt to seize power. In late February 1948, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, with Soviet support, staged a coup d'état, establishing undisputed control over the Czechoslovak government. 12 non-communist government ministers resigned. President Beneš followed suit. Klement Gottwald replaced Beneš as president. This coup turned Czechoslovakia into a one-party communist state virtually overnight. A few days later, the non-communist foreign minister Jan Masaryk was found dead beneath the window of the foreign ministry building. Whether it was suicide or murder remains one of the unsolved mysteries. Women in Hungary also experienced the horrors of the Soviet occupation. During the initial period of the occupation, from 1944 to 1945, Red Army soldiers committed large-scale and systematic mass sexual crimes against Hungarian women. Historical estimates indicate that between 50,000 and 500,000 women and girls were raped in Budapest alone. Hungary, like Czechoslovakia, was not quickly colonized by the Soviet Union. In November 1945, relatively free elections were held in Hungary. The Liberal Independent Smallholders Party won a landslide victory, receiving more than half of the vote. Although the Communists suffered a crushing defeat, they controlled the police, including the State Protection Authority, the political police. Using these controlled positions, the Communists were able to systematically eliminate their political opponents segment by segment through political intrigue and fabricated conspiracies. The State Protection Authority began arresting hundreds of members of the Smallholders Party, ultimately depriving the party of its elected majority in parliament. Officers of the Soviet Ministry of State Security, in late February 1947, kidnapped the General Secretary of the Smallholders Party, Bela Kovac, and deported him to the Soviet Union, where he spent more than 8 years in prison. In May 1947, Prime Minister Ferenc Nagy was forced to resign after the Communists arrested his 5-year-old son, blackmailed Nagy, demanding his resignation in exchange for the safe release of the child. By October 1947, the Communists had abandoned any pretense of pluralism, forcing their nominal coalition partners to cooperate with them. In August 1949, the country was officially declared a Hungarian People's Republic, with the Communists as the only legal party. In Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, the Kremlin pursued similar political strategies. During the conquest of countries and in the initial period of occupation, Red Army soldiers committed mass sexual crimes against the civilian population and committed robberies, except for Bulgaria, which was viewed by the Kremlin as a fraternal Slavic people. These war crimes of the Red Army were a Soviet policy of psychological demoralization. Sexual violence was intended to create a feeling among the occupied population of absolute dominance of the Soviet occupiers over them. In all these countries, the Communists came to power on Red Army tanks. Initially, under control of the occupation administration, including officers of the Soviet political police, a quasi-democratic government was established with mandatory oversight by domestic communists. The Kremlin then consolidated communist dominance in government and created a direct dictatorship. The new communist countries became satellite states of the Soviet Union. Domestic dictators, seeking to emulate the Kremlin dictator, diligently carried out his orders and copied his policies, including the leading role of the Communist Party, repression, and propaganda against the allegedly hostile West. As in the Soviet Union, the Kremlin exercised control over satellite states through terror. In January 1949, the leader of the Polish Communists, Władysław Gomułka, was removed from power, arrested, and imprisoned by order of Stalin. Gomułka's fall was accompanied by mass repressions. At the end of May 1949 in Hungary, the Kremlin and its protégé, Matyas Rákosi, staged a large-scale political show trial in which former Foreign Minister László Rajk was presented as the ringleader of a fabricated conspiracy. As a result, Rajk and his associates were executed. That same year, the prominent member of the Bulgarian Communist Party, Traicho Kostov, and many of his supporters were arrested, convicted, and executed. In 1951, the influential member of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, Rudolf Slonsky, and more than 10 elite communists were arrested and executed. Yugoslavia refused to follow the Kremlin's scenarios. Unlike communist parties in other Eastern European countries, the Yugoslav communists did not come to power on Soviet tanks. Under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, the Yugoslav partisans, also known as the National Liberation Army, created one of the largest resistance movements in Europe. By the end of 1944, they numbered about 650,000 soldiers, organized into 4 armies. During the Second World War, the main aid to the Yugoslav partisans, in the form of weapons and ammunition, came from the Western Allies. The Yugoslav partisans liberated Yugoslavia from Axis rule with limited support from the Red Army, which, together with the Bulgarian army, took part in the Belgrade offensive in the autumn of 1944. Although Soviet troops only passed through the northeastern regions of Serbia, which was an ally of the Allied powers, until early 1945, the total number of women and girls sexually abused by Red Army soldiers is estimated to be more than 5,000. The atrocities of the Soviet soldiers provoked a strong protest from Marshal Josip Broz Tito against the Soviet High Command, which allowed these war crimes. By May 1945, the Yugoslav army controlled the entire territory of Yugoslavia. Thanks to the Allied powers' official recognition of the National Liberation Army at the Tehran Conference, there were no occupation forces in Yugoslavia after the Second World War. Accordingly, there was no occupation administration, and no Kremlin-appointed officials oversaw the Yugoslav government. In November 1945, the People's Front, led by the Communist Party of Yugoslavia under Tito, won a landslide victory in the elections, and the country was named the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. It was a typical communist dictatorship, which ruthlessly dealt with the opposition, maintained total propaganda and the cult of Tito's personality. Although Yugoslavia was a formal ally of the Soviet Union, Tito was unwilling to follow the Kremlin's orders unconditionally. Tito openly supported the communists in the Greek Civil War, while Stalin kept his distance, having agreed with Churchill not to pursue Soviet interests there, and forbade his satellite countries from helping the Greek communists. In 1948, driven by the desire to build a strong, independent economy, Tito developed a development plan independent of Moscow, which led to a diplomatic escalation. Diplomatic relations between the two countries were severed. In 1949, the Yugoslav-Soviet crisis almost escalated into an armed conflict. An invasion of Yugoslavia by the combined forces of neighboring Soviet satellite states, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, was planned. Stalin took Tito's disobedience as a personal insult and organized assassination attempts on Tito, none of which were successful. Stalin's inadequate political actions caused significant damage to the Soviet Union's ambitions in southern Europe and helped Yugoslavia maintain its political independence. A similar, though smaller scale, situation occurred in Albania, where the Communists led the anti-fascist resistance during the Second World War and held real power based on their fight against the invaders, not as a result of Soviet occupation. Enver Hoxha, the leader of the Communist Party of Labour of Albania, admired Stalin but was not his puppet.